So this is the continuation as part two of our celebration of an introduction to the national poet of Bangladesh and the wider known rebel poet Qazi Nazrul Islam. And this is part of the celebration and recognition of poets, writers, thinkers, philosophers, architects of the movement for freedom and liberation in the subcontinent, and the movement contexted in the presence since 1757 of the East India Company and its later form of empire, the British Raj. But essentially, it dates back to a century or so before that time, and it is continuing to the decades since August 1947, when the British formally withdrew or left the subcontinent. And the message and the lesson is for liberation against darkness and submissions and surrender and subjugation and oppression and denial. And the liberation starts from the liberation to have a meal every day and a shelter in the house and the home and the access to the basic amenities for society as just society. Hundreds of millions of people in the three countries that are mainly the territory that was covered by the British Empire, hundreds of millions of people in those countries are deprived of freedom and liberation. And that is something that needs to be changed. And these hundreds of millions of people must be given the freedom and the liberation they have been promised and they were promised, and they are entitled to and they need. Need is what actually leads the topic. So the literature, the music, the poetry written by Nazrul Islam is representative of the contributions by other authors, writers, and poets in the three countries and beyond. And their contributions have not been recognized in the educational programs that have been established or put in place by the successive regimes in Bangladesh, India, or Pakistan. And that is where it should be placed. The education programs must be about liberation, the lesson of freedom, and the liberation as experienced by people being liberated from hunger, famine, dislocation, and denial of justice and equality, regardless of their religious background or orientation or their gender or their sub-sectional or sub-factional location in society. The news from India or news across India is dominated by the distortion of freedom and liberation, the denial of freedom and liberation. The whole big geographical area that is India, today's India, is dominated by residues, remnants of stooges, cultural and ideological and attitudinal stooges and surrogates and slaves, mental slaves left behind by empire. Not necessarily the British Empire, but the mindset of subjugation and collusion with the oppressor force at the expense of the people whose freedom and liberation and rights are being denied in that process. So, for example, the fight for linguistic rights that has been chronicled after 1971 by many writers in Bangladesh and propagandists. They're exaggerating the actual role played by the movement for Bengali language as against the Urdu language being the state language or being the only state language. Exaggerated because the English language is the dominant language in Bangladesh when it comes to the real impact and implication and the importance. And nowhere more than in the observance of 21st February as the date for the language movement for Bengali language. How is it that Bengali language is being observed in the English calendar or the British calendar or the Gregorian calendar, whatever it is called? It is not Bengali or Bangla or anything to do with the subcontinent. The actual date of the memorable fight and martyrdom is actually 8th of Falgun from the calendar, that is the ordinary calendar of the people in Bangladesh. So, for more than nearly 70 years, 52, now it's 70, nearly 70 years, 7 decades, say, they have been celebrating and observing the martyrdom for Bengali language in the English calendar. So, one of the things that I do is point these things out. And when I do that, the mental slaves and the intellectual darkness, inhabitants of darkness, think that I'm wrong and they're right. And they say all kinds of things to justify their being right when they're wrong. And so, therefore, I'm saying that the movement for Bengali language or Bangla language to be given the recognition that it deserves has to be conducted by the movement's supporters and advocates practicing the Bangla language. And because they don't practice, my efforts to convert this into a Bangla language based movement and communication and exercise, I discontinued that because they remain totally, absolutely servile to the celebration of the Bengali language movement in the English calendar. So I'm advocating this again as I started decades ago, and I'm advocating this. And whenever I raise this, the mental slaves, including people who have been in positions of the Bangladeshi government, sometimes, like a man called Tony Hawk, who has lived in Birmingham most of the times. He has been involved in a campaign called the Language Rights for the Bangla language at the United Nations. The question is that there is no problem with that kind of demand. But the test, the veracity of that kind of demand is to be found in the extent, in the fact and the extent of that demand's advocates practicing the Bangla language themselves. At an event held in the Osborne Street more than 10 years ago, I think, or about 10 years ago, where I accidentally happened to be present because I was invited casually by one of the promoters to go there. And when I went there, I found that it was a gathering organized by Tony Hawk and his allies or contacts in London to take further their claim or demand for the Bangla language to be recognized at the United Nations or by the United Nations or at the United Nations level. And the literature or the main slogan, signboard in the room where the assembly was taking place or the gathering was taking place was in English. And I stood up, but there was no word written in the Bangla language. So I said, why are you doing this? This is contradictory. Absolute mental slavery. Whatever words I used were words expressing the same attitude and analysis and finding. And they did not like it. And the person who had invited me, who shall remain nameless here because it will be absolutely overwhelmingly embarrassing for him, or it should be. I shall not name him, but he knows exactly who he is. Then stopped talking to me for any number of period or months after that. Now he thought that I was actually wrong to point this out. I wasn't wrong, and I'm asking him to stop being so false and artificial. Now, extrapolating his behavior and his response, and to include his kind of likes in Bangladesh and in Pakistan and India on other issues about autonomy and sovereignty and linguistic independence and recognition and parity, universal recognition and parity. I'm saying to all of those others, stop being so false and dishonest. These are concepts. Concepts of freedom and independence are not possible to be realized by being false and artificial and dishonest and petty and opportunistic and ignorant. And I think the reason why the 73 years since 1947, the subcontinent, post-British subcontinent, has had millions, hundreds of millions of people in poverty and hunger and worse conditions is because, quote, the leaders or the grabbers of the powers in those countries have been dominated by people who are ignorant and ill-educated or ill-schooled and essentially dishonest and seekers of their personal petty greed and opportunities and agenda. That has to end. Otherwise, hundreds of millions of people will remain hungry and famished and denied and violated. So when the former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations or Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, an Indian politician, Thapa, his denunciation of Winston Churchill as the man who was responsible for the genocidal withdrawal of the resources from the subcontinent in 1943, and that resulted in the famine and the death by famine and hunger of 3 to 4 million people. When he says that, that is fact. But he does not say how many millions of people in India or in Bangladesh or Pakistan altogether since 1940s, Churchill's genocidal withdrawal of resources causing that genocidal deaths of these millions of Bengalis mainly. How many other people have died due to hunger? Due to hunger and famine. And that is the question. So, therefore, it is not good enough to condemn the former colonialist leader. That condemnation obliges the condemner to take account of the behavior of the so-called free India and free Pakistan leaders, or independent India and independent Pakistan leaders. What have those leaders done? Have they behaved as badly as Churchill did, or have they behaved in a way that lives of people have not been lost due to hunger and famine and want of food? So the root of the migration nightmare that Priti Patel, the current British Home Secretary, is peddling is in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, as far as the subcontinent is concerned, and in other smaller countries in that part of Asia. And we shall be extrapolating the analysis to include most of Africa today, despite the fact that there are predictions demographically that Nigeria by the end of this century will take over and become a giant and all the rest of it. That has not happened. And before that happens, there will be hundreds of millions of hungry people, starving people, dying people in Africa, including in Nigeria. So we have to be realistic and truthful and honest. And we have to be absolutely fair and ethical about the behavior of the imperialists as well as the freedom fighters and liberation campaigners. And we shall be continuing that in the next edition of this broadcast.